mud was the first thing Elena noticed, not the animal. The mud. It stretched across the gravel shoulder of Route 9 in long, dark smears, as if something heavy had been dragging itself toward the drainage ditch for a very long time. The headlights of her pickup truck caught the wet ground and turned it copper, and Elena slowed down because she almost never saw mud on this particular stretch of road. It never collected here. There was no reason for it. She stopped the truck. She did not turn off the engine. She sat behind the wheel and looked at the mud and told herself it was probably a deer. Deer sometimes got clipped by cars out here and wandered off the asphalt to die. She had seen it before. It was not pleasant, but it was a natural thing, and she would note the location and call the county line in the morning, and that would be the end of it. But then she saw the eye. Just the one. A single pale eye catching the edge of her headlight beam, low to the ground, half submerged in the tall grass at the lip of the ditch. It was not blinking. It was not moving. It was just open, looking at her with a steadiness that made the back of her neck go cold, because that was not how injured animals looked at people. Injured animals looked with fear. Whatever was in that ditch was looking at her with something else entirely. Elena sat with her hand on the door handle for a full 30 seconds. She was a practical woman. She was 34 years old, and she had lived alone in rural Montana for 6 of those years, and she did not spook easily. She also did not, as a general rule, step out of a running vehicle in the dark to investigate unidentified large animals in roadside ditches. That was a reasonable policy. She liked that policy. She got out of the truck anyway. The cold hit her immediately. November in that part of Montana was not a gentle thing. It came in from the northwest with its teeth out, and it did not apologize. Elena pulled her jacket tighter and walked toward the ditch with her phone flashlight on, because the headlights did not reach far enough into the grass. He was enormous. That was the first thing her brain processed, not the matted gray and black fur, not the mud caked so thick along his ribs that she could not tell at first glance where the animal ended and the earth began, not the shallow, labored rise and fall of his chest. The size. He was the largest dog she had ever seen in her life, stretched along the floor of the ditch with his front legs folded beneath him, and his back legs simply gone. Not actually gone, but splayed out behind him with no tension in the muscles, as if they had simply given up. She crouched down and shone the light carefully. He turned his head and looked at her. That eye. Up close it was amber-colored with a vertical pupil that caught the light and held it, and Elena felt something move through her chest that was not quite fear, and not quite recognition, but was somewhere between the two. She had owned dogs growing up. She knew how dogs looked at people. They looked with their whole face, with their ears forward and their mouths soft and their tails doing something. This animal looked at her with one eye and nothing else, and the look said, "I see you, and I am deciding." She did not touch him yet. She sat back on her heels and spoke. She told him she was not going to hurt him. She told him she was going to go to her truck and come back. She told him she had a blanket in the back seat that her mother had given her 2 Christmases ago, and that it was a perfectly good blanket, and she was willing to put it under a possibly dying strange animal in a ditch, which was the most generous thing she could imagine offering at that moment. He kept looking at her. She went to the truck. She got the blanket. She also got the jumper cables, not because she needed them, but because she suddenly felt that she wanted something in her hand that was made of metal and chain. She stood beside the truck for a moment and breathed out a long breath that fogged in the cold air. Then she went back. He had not moved. She approached from the side, not from the front, because something in her knew not to approach from the front. She laid the blanket open on the ground beside him, and she talked the entire time. Low, steady, unremarkable words about the cold and the road and the fact that she had eggs at home and had planned to make an omelet for dinner, which now seemed like it was going to be a later meal than expected. When she touched him, he did not flinch. He did not growl. He let out a single, very slow breath and turned his head an inch so that his chin rested on the edge of the blanket. She slid her arms under him. He was not as heavy as he should have been. That was the thing that made her throat tighten as she lifted him. The fact that she could lift him at all. An animal this size should have been impossible to carry. Instead, he was all jutting bone and loose skin and soaked fur. And she got him off the ground and walked him to the truck and folded him into the back seat with her heart making a sound in her ears that she did not have a word for. She drove home. She did not call anyone. She thought about calling the wildlife rescue hotline she had saved in her phone 2 years ago after she found an injured hawk in her garden. She thought about calling her neighbor, Carol Hadley, who kept horses and knew more about animals than anyone else on the road. She thought about calling her sister in Billings. She called no one. She drove home, and the animal in the back seat breathed steadily and watched the road through the rear window with that one calm amber eye. Her house sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, a ranch-style property with 3 acres of land behind it that backed up against a stand of Douglas fir. She had bought it for the quiet. She got the animal out of the truck the same way she had gotten him in, arms under his weight, moving slowly, talking the entire time. She carried him through the front door and laid him on the kitchen floor, on the blanket, and then she stood back and looked at him under actual light for the first time. He was gray. Not the gray of a standard husky or a working dog, but a deep, layered gray that shifted toward black along his spine and silver along his jaw and lower legs. His paws were extraordinary, wide and splayed and thick-padded, the kind of paws that were built for serious ground. His ears were large and triangular, and they moved, even now, tracking sounds in the house, cataloging them. His tail was thick and heavily furred, and it lay still against the floor, not wagging, not tucked, simply still. His face was not a dog's face. She noticed this and did not know what to do with it. It was too long, the muzzle was too deep, the eyes were set too far apart, and they were too light and too steady, and when he looked at her from the kitchen floor she felt again that sensation of being assessed. She got a bowl of water and put it near his head. He looked at it, he looked at her, he drank. She made eggs. She scrambled 4 of them because she did not know what else to offer, and she remembered that protein was important for malnourished animals, and she was not going to drive to the feed store at 10 o'clock at night. She put them in a second bowl and set it down beside him. He ate. Not with the grateful, desperate gulping of an animal that had been starving. He ate with attention, each bite deliberate. When he finished, he put his head down on the edge of the blanket and closed his eyes. Elena sat on the kitchen floor across from him and watched him breathe. She told herself that in the morning she would call a vet. She told herself that he was a dog, a very large and unusual dog, and that she would get him treated and find his owner or find him a home. She told herself this twice. He opened one eye and looked at her. She looked back. She told herself this a third time. She slept on the couch that night rather than her bedroom, because she did not want to leave him alone. She left the kitchen light on low. At some point in the early hours she woke to the sound of his breathing, slow and measured, and the sound was oddly steady in the dark house. She pulled the couch blanket tighter and listened to it until she fell back asleep. In the morning, he was sitting up, not lying down, not struggling into a seated position, sitting, in the center of the kitchen floor, upright and still, watching the back door with the full attention of an animal that had somewhere very specific to be. When Elena came into the kitchen, he turned his head and looked at her, and she noticed that the look had shifted from the night before. The previous night he had looked at her like a decision being made. This morning, he looked at her the way you look at something that has already been decided. She filled his water bowl. He drank. She noticed that he had moved to the side of the kitchen that put the interior wall at his back and the door in his line of sight, and that the position was not accidental. She noticed that when she moved around the kitchen, his eyes tracked her without his head moving. She noticed that when a car passed on the road, faint, distant, his ears moved before the sound was clear enough for her to hear, and they did not relax until the car had passed and the silence returned. She noticed a great number of things that morning that she put in a particular mental folder and did not immediately examine. She named him Bruno. She did not think too hard about why. It seemed to fit the weight of him, the solidity. She said it out loud as she set his bowl down. Bruno. He did not respond to it the way a dog responds to a name, the ears coming up, the attention sharpening. He simply continued eating. But she thought she saw, in the slow blink of one amber eye, something like tolerance. She called the vet at 8 o'clock. Dr. Callum Pierce's office was in a town called Hartfield, 14 miles east. She had used him twice before, for a cat she had for 3 years until it died of old age, and he had been straightforward and competent and had never made her feel foolish for caring about an animal. She explained over the phone that she had found an injured dog, that he was large, that he seemed to be improving but that she wanted him looked at. Dr. Pierce's receptionist gave her an afternoon appointment. She spent the morning watching Bruno. He stood, eventually, with a carefulness that told her his legs had been through something serious. He tested each one, slowly, and she could see the moment each one decided to hold. By 10 in the morning he was walking, stiffly but without falling, and by 11 he had made a full circuit of the ground floor of her house. She followed at a distance because she felt, obscurely, that she should not crowd him while he did this, that this was his process and she was a witness to it, not a participant. He checked every room. He noted every window. He stood in her bedroom doorway for a long moment looking in, and then he turned and walked back to the kitchen and lay down near the back door. He did not go into the bedroom. He had simply looked. She took him to the vet in the afternoon. She had borrowed Carol Hadley's van because she could not fit him comfortably in the cab of her pickup, and Carol had looked at Bruno through the fence with an expression Elena could not quite interpret before saying, "You found that on Route 9? Elena had said yes. Carol had said, "All right then, take the van." Bruno rode in the back of the van on the same moving blanket. He sat upright the entire time, watching the road through the rear window. He did not pace. He did not make sounds. When they reached the clinic and Elena opened the rear doors, he stepped out onto the parking lot concrete and stopped and stood for a moment with his nose lifted, sorting through whatever the air in a vet clinic parking lot was made of. Then he walked toward the front door. Not because Elena led him. She had not even put a leash on him yet. She had forgotten in the moment of watching him step down from the van with that focused, unhurried authority. He simply walked toward the clinic entrance as if this was the next logical step, and Elena picked up the leash she had looped around her wrist and followed him. Inside the waiting room, 3 dogs and their owners went quiet. The quiet happened fast. A golden retriever that had been spinning in happy circles at the end of its leash sat down. A small terrier mix that had been yapping since Elena walked in stopped mid-bark and moved behind its owner's legs. The third dog, a large German Shepherd mix, turned its head away and looked at the wall. The owners did not notice right away, because owners rarely noticed the things their animals noticed first, but the animals noticed. Bruno walked to an empty corner of the waiting room and lay down facing the entrance. He put his head on his paws and blinked slowly, and that was that. Elena stood at the reception desk and gave her name, and tried not to stare at the corner where the largest animal in the room was somehow taking up the least attention. The examination started normally. Dr. Pierce weighed Bruno. He was 68 pounds, which was low, very low, and checked his temperature, and his eyes and his teeth and his lymph nodes. He pressed along his ribs with careful hands and watched Bruno's face. Bruno's face gave him nothing. Then Dr. Pierce stopped. He stopped with both hands on Bruno's jawline, looking at the teeth. He stayed there for a long moment. Then he straightened and said, with very careful professional neutrality, "Give me one moment." He came back with a woman Elena had not met, who introduced herself as Dr. Yates, a colleague who specialized in wildlife, and who was apparently visiting the clinic that week and happened to be in the back room. Dr. Yates looked at Bruno for 30 seconds. Then she took out her phone and took 4 photographs. Then she looked at Elena with an expression that was composed and kind, and also held something underneath it that Elena would later describe as controlled alarm. Dr. Yates said, "Can I ask where you found this animal?" Elena told her, "Route 9. The drainage ditch. The mud and the eye." Dr. Yates nodded. She said, "How long have you had him?" 18 hours, Elena said. Dr. Yates nodded again. She and Dr. Pierce exchanged a look that lasted less than a second and communicated a great many things. Then Dr. Yates said, "This is a wolf hybrid, high content, possibly 80% or more," and she said it in the tone of someone delivering information that would rearrange the furniture in a room, which was exactly what it did. Elena sat down on the metal examination table. She did not mean to. Her legs simply organized themselves into a seated position without consulting her. Bruno, on the examination floor, turned his head and looked at her. He held the look for a moment, then he crossed the room, 3 slow, deliberate steps, and put his head in her lap. Elena put her hand on his skull, which was the size of something she did not have a comparison for, and sat on the table in a vet clinic in Hartfield, Montana, and understood that the ground she had thought she was standing on had not existed for at least 18 hours, and possibly longer, and that the animal with his head in her lap had known this before she did. Outside, the golden retriever had stopped spinning. The terrier had not come back out from behind its owner's legs. The waiting room was very quiet. The November afternoon pressed against the clinic windows, gray and flat and cold. And inside the examination room, Elena sat with one hand on a wolf's head and tried to remember if she had ever made a decision in her life that had actually been hers. She thought about it for a while. She was not sure she had. She drove home with Bruno in the back of the borrowed van, the heater running, the road empty in both directions. She did not turn the radio on. She did not need to fill the silence. The sound of his breathing was enough. It had been enough since the night before, and she was only now noticing that. The Douglas firs behind her house were dark shapes against the last of the light when she pulled up the driveway. She opened the rear doors and Bruno stepped out onto the gravel and stood for a moment looking at the tree line. His ears were up and forward, his nose was working. He turned and walked to the front door and waited for her to open it. She opened it. He went inside. She stood on the doorstep for a moment in the cold, looking out at the road and the dark field and the sky that was pulling the last of the light out of it. She thought about the word the doctor had used, the word that was supposed to change things. She went inside. She locked the door. She went to the kitchen and filled his bowl. He ate. She watched him and thought, well, here we are. And the thing that she would not understand for months, the thing that would only become clear much later, was that he was watching her too, over the edge of the bowl, with those amber eyes, and thinking something that was not so different. The days that followed had a rhythm that Elena did not plan and could not explain. She woke each morning to find Bruno already awake, already positioned, not in the same place. He was never in the same place 2 mornings in a row, but he was always somewhere that made a kind of tactical sense, near the front door, or facing the large rear window, or in the narrow hallway where he could see both ends of the house from a single point. She noticed this. She added it to the folder she had opened in her mind and did not yet examine. She went to work. She managed the administrative accounts for a small logging equipment distributor out of Hartfield, which meant she worked mostly by phone and email from her home office. She had been doing this for 4 years. It was steady work and it suited her need for quiet, and it required no particular performance. She sat at her desk and processed invoices and answered emails, and Bruno lay on the floor 6 feet away and did not bother her. He did not bark. This was the first thing she tried to explain to her neighbor Carol. When Carol called on the 3rd day to ask how the enormous animal from the Route 9 ditch was getting along, Elena said, "He doesn't bark." Carol said, "Well, that's nice." Elena said, "No, I mean he doesn't make any sound at all. Not when cars pass, not when birds land outside, not when the postman comes up the drive." Carol was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's less nice." What Bruno did instead of barking was position himself. When the postman's truck turned onto the driveway, Bruno was at the window before the sound of the engine was clear enough for Elena to distinguish it. He watched. He did not move or make a sound. He watched until the truck left, then he turned from the window and walked back to wherever he had been. The postman, a pleasant older man named Gerald, knocked one afternoon to deliver a package too large for the mailbox, and Elena opened the door with Bruno standing 2 feet behind her. Gerald's hand froze in mid-reach. He said, "That's a big dog." Elena said, "Yes?" Gerald said, "Really big." He handed over the package with both hands and kept his eyes on Bruno the entire time. Bruno sat down, slowly, and Gerald, for reasons he probably could not have articulated, relaxed. She took Bruno on a walk that first week, down the long driveway and out onto the road, in the cold mid-morning when traffic was minimal. She had bought a harness because a collar seemed inadequate for an animal of this size and structure, and she had put it on him that morning with more ceremony than the act probably deserved. He had allowed it with complete stillness, which she was beginning to understand was his version of patience. They went down the driveway and turned left onto the road. He did not walk beside her in the loose, accommodating way of a dog that has been trained to heel. He walked slightly ahead and to the left, and he moved in a way that covered ground without appearing to hurry, which was not something she had seen in an animal before. She had to extend her stride to keep up. She thought about correcting this, about pulling him back to walk beside her, and then she noticed what was happening in front of them, and stopped thinking about it. The road curved ahead toward Carol's property, and Carol's 2 Labrador retrievers, brown and black, both large and loud and exuberantly friendly under normal circumstances, came racing to the fence line as they always did when Elena walked past. They were already barking, already throwing themselves at the chain link, with the cheerful intensity of dogs who had never once considered that a greeting could be unwelcome. Bruno slowed. Not stopped, slowed. He walked toward the fence in one long, low movement, and something about the way he moved, the lowering of his center of gravity, the absolute stillness of his tail, the way his ears went flat then forward, was a communication in a language that the 2 labs understood immediately and completely. The barking stopped. The jumping stopped. The brown lab sat down. The black lab backed up 2 steps and then also sat down. Both of them looked at Bruno the way you look at something that does not require a response from you because it has already decided everything relevant to the situation. Bruno walked past the fence. He did not look at them. Elena looked at them. They watched Bruno go. She caught up to Bruno and walked beside him the rest of the way down the road and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. She had watched 2 large, confident dogs decide in less than 3 seconds that they would simply rather not. She had watched them reach this conclusion not because of a threat or a sound, but because of the way Bruno moved through space, as if he were the only thing in it that mattered. She thought about this for the rest of the walk. She thought about it over lunch. She thought about it while she answered an email about invoice discrepancies and could not stop glancing at Bruno, who was lying on his side in a patch of afternoon sunlight, with his eyes half open and his legs stretched out, and who looked, in that posture, almost gentle. Almost. The folder in her mind was getting full. She had done research, of course. After the visit to Dr. Pierce and Dr. Yates, she had come home and opened her laptop and typed high-content wolf hybrid behavior and read until midnight. She read about intelligence that was not canine intelligence, about problem-solving that operated on a different level, about the fact that wolf hybrids did not respond to the same training systems as domestic dogs because they did not process authority the same way. A dog wanted to please its person. A wolf measured whether its person was worth following. She had read this and sat back in her chair and thought about the way Bruno had walked into her house, the first morning, and checked every room with systematic care. She thought about the way he positioned himself. She thought about the 2 labs at the fence. She did not sleep particularly well that night. She fed him in the morning and he ate, and she watched him eat, and she said, "So what are you then?" She said it out loud, to the kitchen, to him. He looked up from the bowl with those light eyes and held her gaze for a moment before going back to eating. She took this as the most honest answer she was likely to get. He gained weight over the following 2 weeks. It happened fast, the way it does with young animals who were underfed rather than sick. His ribs disappeared under muscle. His coat, once dried and cleaned, was layered and dense and moved in the cold air when he walked outside like something that had been built for much harder winters than Montana's. He stood straighter. He moved differently. The carefulness left his legs. The week he was fully recovered was the week Elena understood she was in different territory. It happened in the front yard on a Tuesday. She was carrying wood from the side of the house to the porch. She heated with a wood stove through the worst of winter, and she had let the supply run low, and she had made 3 trips and was on the 4th when she misjudged the height of the porch step and went down hard. Not a serious fall, scraped palms, a bruised knee, a short, sharp intake of breath from the shock of it more than the pain. Bruno was beside her before she had finished processing that she had fallen. He did not come running. He was simply there, in that way that she was beginning to recognize as distinctly his. No wasted movement, no performance, just presence. He stood over her with his body between her and the yard, and he did not make a sound. He looked out at the tree line and back at her, and out at the tree line again. She sat up on the cold porch boards. She looked at him. He looked at the tree line. She said, "I'm fine. Thank you." He looked at her once. Then he looked at the tree line again, and she understood that he was not checking on her so much as he was checking the perimeter. That for the duration of the moment she had been down and potentially unable to function, he had put himself between her and whatever might have used that moment against her. She sat on the porch with her scraped hands in her lap and thought about that for a long time. Inside, on the kitchen counter, her phone rang. It was her sister, calling from Billings the way she did every Tuesday. Elena watched it ring through the window. She did not go in to answer it. She sat on the porch with a wolf and watched the tree line. The calls started with her friend Nina, who lived in Missoula and called once a week and was one of 3 people Elena told about Bruno before the vet visit changed the nature of the conversation. Nina had said, on hearing the initial story, "Elena, you absolute chaos agent. You have a stray the size of a sofa." Elena had laughed. Nina had asked for photographs. Then the vet visit happened. Elena called Nina back. Nina went quiet for a much longer time than Elena expected. Then she said, "Well, okay. And then, are you going to keep him?" And Elena had said, "I don't know," and then had said, "Probably," and then had said, "Yes," and Nina had said, "I thought so. Because apparently, I know you." The question of keeping him was not simple. This she understood more clearly with each passing day. It was not a question of attachment. The attachment was already a settled fact, though she had not announced it to herself formally. It was a question of legality, of structure, of what this animal needed that she might not be able to provide. These were real questions. She was not someone who pushed real questions away. But she had watched him lie in the patch of afternoon light with his legs stretched out. She had watched him walk toward Carol's fence in that long, low, definitive way. She had watched him stand over her on the porch and check the tree line. And every morning she woke to find him already awake, already watching, already positioned between her and whatever the world was planning to bring through the door. She thought about what it would mean to give that up. She thought about it for exactly 1 evening. Then she called Dr. Yates at the clinic and said, "I need to understand what I'm dealing with and how to do this correctly, and I need you to tell me everything." Dr. Yates said, "All right, get a notebook." Elena got a notebook. Outside, Bruno was in the yard in the last of the November light, standing at the property's edge where the fenced grass met the start of the Douglas firs. He was very still. His ears were forward. He was looking at something in the trees that Elena could not see and could not hear. She watched him from the kitchen window while Dr. Yates talked. The trees were dark and the sky behind them was the gray of old iron, and Bruno stood at the edge of the yard like something drawn there by the dark itself. And Elena watched him, and wrote in her notebook and thought, whatever is out there, he knows about it. Whatever is out there, it knows about him. She held the phone and wrote and looked out the window and thought, I do not know what I am doing, but I am going to do it anyway. Which had always, if she was being honest, been more or less how she operated. The call with Dr. Yates lasted 1 hour and 14 minutes. Elena filled 6 pages of her notebook. She wrote things like, not food motivated in the same way, and needs to know you are worth following, and we'll test limits once, only once, and the response matters, and pack structure is not dominance as people think it is investment, it is loyalty, earned over time. She wrote, he chose to be in your space. That is significant. She underlined this twice. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table and looked at her notebook and looked at Bruno, who had come back inside and was lying on his side in the kitchen doorway, and she had the clear, disorienting sensation of standing at the beginning of something she could not yet see the shape of. She made tea, she sat. She was good at sitting with things she could not see the shape of. 6 years alone in a ranch house in rural Montana had made her patient in ways she had not been at 24. She had learned that not every question needed to be answered immediately, that some things required time to show you what they were. Bruno watched her from the doorway. She said, all right, we are going to figure this out. He blinked, slowly, once. She took this as agreement, which was probably optimistic, but it was all she had. The practical questions arrived with the coming week like items on a list she had not written herself. The first was the legal one. Dr. Yates had given her the name of a wildlife specialist named Oliver Grant, who worked out of Bozeman and had spent 20 years dealing with the specific overlap between wildlife law and private animal keeping in Montana. Elena called him on a Thursday morning. Oliver Grant had a voice like gravel and a way of delivering complicated information with very few syllables. He told her that Montana's laws regarding wolf hybrids depended on verified content percentage, which required testing, which required a blood sample and a certified laboratory. He told her that until content was established, Bruno existed in a legal space that was neither fully domestic animal nor fully protected wildlife, and that this space was not comfortable but was navigable. He gave her 3 names, a certified wildlife genetics lab in Billings, a legal aid organization that dealt with exotic and hybrid animal cases, and a licensed exotic animal permit office in Helena. He also said, does he behave? And she said, he behaves better than most people I know. And Oliver Grant said, that will help. She sent the blood sample on a Friday. She waited. In the meantime, she built. She had spoken with Dr. Yates again about enclosure, about the kind of outdoor space that a high-content wolf hybrid needed and deserved. Not a cage, a space. Dr. Yates had been very clear about the distinction. Elena spent a weekend on the internet and another 2 evenings on the phone with an enclosure specialist from Whitefish, and then she ordered materials and booked 3 weekends to do the work herself. She was a capable builder. She had put in her own fence line the first year at the ranch property, and she had built the raised garden beds in the back that she no longer used but was still proud of. Building things with her hands was one of the ways she thought. The enclosure was 600 square feet, reinforced at the base against digging, with sight lines to the tree line. She put in a shelter structure that was insulated and large enough for him to stand in without stooping. Bruno watched the construction with great interest. He sat in the yard on the first build weekend and tracked her movements with his eyes, and occasionally came close enough to investigate a specific piece of material or tool. He smelled everything twice. He sat beside the unbuilt fence post holes and looked at them with an expression she was beginning to read as assessment. She told him, it's for you. He looked at the post holes. She said, you'll like it. He looked at her. On the second weekend, he helped. Not in any way a dog would help. Not fetching things or getting underfoot or performing enthusiasm. He walked the perimeter of the space she was building, slowly and deliberately, multiple times, and then he went back to the yard. She realized on the 3rd lap that he was measuring it, not literally, not with any tool, but in that particular wolf way she was beginning to recognize, the body taking data and filing it. The enclosure was finished on a Sunday afternoon in late November, 3 weeks after she had found him. She opened the gate and stood back. Bruno walked in. He made the full circuit. He went to the shelter and smelled the interior. He went to the far corner and stood with his nose in the air. Then he walked back to the gate and sat down and looked at her. She said, do you like it? He turned and walked back to the shelter and lay down in the entrance to it, facing the yard, and closed his eyes. She took this as a yes. The blood results came back 10 days later. The email from the lab used language like high-content lupine genomic markers and estimated wild wolf ancestry in the range of 78 to 86%. Dr. Yates, when Elena forwarded it, replied in 3 minutes with, "That's about what I expected." Oliver Grant, when Elena called him, said, "All right, we work with this." He walked her through the permit process, which was not quick and not cheap, and required 2 home visits from a state wildlife officer who came on separate occasions and made notes on a clipboard and spoke very little. The first visit, the officer stood in the kitchen and asked questions while Bruno sat in the far corner and watched him. The officer kept glancing at Bruno. Bruno did not glance back. He simply watched, and the steady quality of his attention was, Elena had learned, its own kind of message. The officer wrote things on his clipboard. On his way out, he paused at the door and said, "How long have you had him?" Elena said, 5 weeks. He said, "He's very calm." Elena said, "He's always calm." The officer nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing something away, and left. The second visit came 3 weeks later and lasted 40 minutes, and ended with a set of conditions attached to a temporary permit. Conditions which included the enclosure specifications she had already met, and a behavioral observation period of 90 days during which she was required to keep a log. She agreed to all of it. She drove home from the permit office in Helena, with a folder of paperwork on the passenger seat, and Bruno in the back of Carol's borrowed van, and she felt something she could not quite name. Not relief, because relief was for when something difficult was over, and this was not over. Not pride exactly. Something closer to the feeling of having stood in a river and let the current push against you and not moved. She said this to Nina on the phone that evening. Nina said, "That is such a you description of a good thing happening." Elena laughed. Bruno, from the kitchen, raised his head and looked toward the sound. Elena waved at him. He put his head back down. Nina said, "So he's staying." Elena said, "He was always staying." Nina said, "You know that's not how rescue is supposed to work." Elena said, "I know." He didn't seem to care. The 90-day observation period was unremarkable, which was itself remarkable. Elena wrote in the log each evening, "Behavioral status stable, social interactions appropriate, no incidents." She filled 6 pages of the log's grid. She noted the date he first came to the door and waited for her when she was late returning from a trip to town. She noted the afternoon he spent 3 hours at the far corner of the enclosure, watching a herd of white-tailed deer cross the field beyond the fence, perfectly still, perfectly quiet, watching with the concentration of something ancient, and patient, and precise. She noted the evening he first slept inside the house for the full night, instead of switching between the house and the enclosure. She noted how he positioned himself, at the end of the hallway with sight lines to both the front and back doors, and how his breathing through the night had been the thing that finally, for the first time in 3 years of living alone, made the house feel occupied, in a way that had nothing to do with company. She did not note this in the official log. She wrote it in the other notebook, the one she kept on her own. The officer came back at the end of 90 days and read the log and asked 3 questions, and then signed the paperwork for a full residential permit. Elena shook his hand at the door. As he walked to his truck, Bruno appeared at her side, not running, not performing, simply there, standing beside her in the cold morning air, watching the officer's truck turn around in the driveway and head back toward the road. The officer raised a hand from his window as he pulled away. Elena raised hers back. Beside her, Bruno watched the truck until it was out of sight. Then he turned and went back inside. Elena stood on the porch for a moment in the quiet. The paperwork was done. The permit was official. The permit said he was hers in the way that law could say such a thing, which was not the same as the way she understood him to be hers, and not the same as the way she suspected he understood her to be his. But it was enough. It was the door, opened, and they both went through it. She went inside and filled his bowl, and he ate, and she stood at the counter with her coffee, and watched him, and thought about the night she had stopped the truck on Route 9, about the eye in the grass, about the decision she had watched him make before she had made hers. She had thought, that night, that she was the one doing the rescuing. She was beginning to understand that this was not the full story. That the full story had 2 sides, as the real ones always do, and that his side had started long before she stopped the truck, in whatever hard country he had crossed before the ditch, in whatever life he had lived that had given him the patience to lie in the cold mud and wait for the right person to stop. She did not know his whole story. She did not know where he had come from or what he had been before the road. She did not know how long he had been traveling or what had happened to whatever pack or situation he had existed within before he ended up cold and thin in a November ditch on Route 9 in Montana. What she knew was what came after. What she knew was the amber eyes in the flashlight beam, and the one slow breath when she touched him, and the way he had walked toward her door that first morning like something that had been decided. What she knew was that the decision was not hers. She had thought it was. She had thought that was how it worked. You found an animal, you took it in, you made a choice. She had believed this right up to the moment she stood in Dr. Yates's examination room and felt his weight settle into her lap and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she had not taken him anywhere. He had let himself be carried. There was a difference. It was not a small one. She drank her coffee. He finished eating and lifted his head and looked at her. She looked back. She said, "Good morning." He turned toward the back window and looked out at the yard and the tree line and the cold November sky. She thought that was probably enough ceremony for one morning. She went back to work. The law had given her a permit. What it had not given her was an answer to the question she had been carrying since the night in the ditch, the question that grew heavier as the weeks became months, and the months settled into something that felt more and more like a life arranged around a set of needs she had not anticipated. The question was, what does this animal require of me that I do not yet know how to give? She had read everything she could find. She had spoken with Dr. Yates and Oliver Grant and a wildlife behavior specialist in Missoula named Dr. Agnes Howell, who had spent 15 years studying wolf-dog interactions in Montana and who talked about pack cognition with the specificity of someone translating a language she had learned to love. Dr. Howell had told her that the relationship between a high-content wolf hybrid and its primary human was not like a dog-owner relationship and not like a wildlife keeper relationship, and was not like anything else she would have a ready framework for. She had said, "Think of it as a negotiation that started the night you picked him up and has not finished yet. And think of what you bring to the negotiation as being at least as important as what he does." Elena had written this down. She had sat with it for a week. Then she had called Dr. Howell back and said, "What do I bring?" And Dr. Howell had said, "Consistency, calm, the willingness not to perform. He already knows what you are. The question is whether you do." This had been useful. It was also, Elena reflected, slightly terrifying. She was consistent. She could be consistent. She kept to a schedule without finding it confining. The work hours, the outdoor time, the evening quiet. She had always been someone who ran on routine, who found comfort in the repetition of known things. This, it turned out, was a quality that translated. Bruno organized himself around her schedule within 2 weeks of its establishment. He ate when she signaled that it was time. He settled when she settled. He was at the door when she came home, not because he had been waiting anxiously, but because he had, apparently, calculated her return window to within about 15 minutes, and simply positioned himself accordingly when the window opened. She tested this accidentally one afternoon by coming home 40 minutes early. He was not at the door. He was in the enclosure, in the far corner, looking at the tree line. He turned when she pulled up the driveway, looked at her truck and walked unhurriedly to the gate. She went to the gate and said, "I'm early." He looked at her. She said, "Did you account for that?" He turned and walked to the shelter and lay down. She stood at the gate, mildly embarrassed to have expected anything different. What she had not expected, what no book or specialist had prepared her for, was the silence. She was not by nature an uncomfortable person with silence. She had chosen her solitary rural life with her eyes open and had never particularly missed the noise of more populated arrangements. But the silence that Bruno brought into her house was a different category of silence. It was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of full presence, of a large and intelligent creature that did not fill space with sound the way humans did, that communicated instead through position and attention and the particular vocabulary of its body. She learned that vocabulary slowly. She learned that the low position of his tail meant neutrality, and the high curl of it over his back meant something she could only describe as confidence. She learned that the slow blink meant ease, and the sustained hard stare meant something was wrong, and the slight turn of his head to the left meant he had heard something she hadn't. She learned that when he pressed against her leg without looking at her, it was comfort being offered, not demanded. She learned all of this the way you learn the customs of a place you have moved to, by watching and waiting, and occasionally getting it wrong and correcting. The winter deepened. Snow came in December and did not leave. The driveway froze, the road iced. Elena laid in supplies the way she did every year, food and firewood and medications and extra propane for the backup heater, and then she hunkered down into the winter routine that she had perfected over 6 years. Bruno loved the snow. This was the word she used, and she was not embarrassed by it. Loved, not with the loud, rolling enthusiasm of a dog encountering snow for the first time, with a kind of deep, cellular recognition, The way you recognize a place you have always known. He moved through it differently, with more ease, with less of the careful placement of steps he sometimes used in the dry yard. In deep snow he moved as if it were his natural medium, and watching him in it was one of the more arresting things she had seen since he arrived. He went out in the snow early each morning before Elena was up and walked the perimeter of the property in long, unhurried loops, and his tracks were always there when she came out with her coffee. A double line of wide-pawed prints going out and coming back, methodical, thorough. She followed them once, curious. They went to every corner of the property, every fence line, every gate. He had been checking the territory. Every morning, every inch of it. She thought about this over her coffee. She thought about what it meant to inhabit a piece of land so completely that you could account for everything on it, every morning, without fail. She thought about the fact that she had lived on this same land for 6 years and had never known it the way he knew it after 3 months. She mentioned this to her friend Nina on one of their Thursday calls. Nina said, "He's made the property his." She said, "Yeah, I think so." Nina said, "Does that bother you?" She thought about it for a moment, then she said, "No. It feels like security." Nina went quiet and then said, "You know that's not a normal thing to feel about a predator checking your fence line." Elena said, "I know." Nina said, "Okay." And then, "Good." The relationship between them was not, by this point, describable in the language she would have used in November. She had started with rescue language, found, taken in, caring for. The language had stopped fitting sometime around the end of December, when she realized that Bruno made decisions in the house that she observed and navigated around, not the other way. He had decided which side of the couch she sat on, not by direct interference but by the fact that he positioned himself in a way that made the right side of the couch the obvious choice. And after 3 weeks, she had simply stopped sitting on the left side without noticing the change. He had decided when the workday ended. Not precisely, but she noticed that around 4 in the afternoon he began moving through the house differently, not restless, but mobilized, as if the internal clock he ran on had registered a shift. She found that her own rhythm had begun to respond to his. She wrapped up her work earlier. She went outside in the last light more often. She was outdoors more in the winter than she had been in the 6 years previous, which was not a small thing. Her sister Laura called in January and said, "You sound different." Elena said, "Do I?" Laura said, "You sound slower." Elena said, "Slower?" Laura said, "Quieter. In a good way, like you're actually there when you talk." Elena considered this for the rest of the day. She thought about the word slower. She thought about what it meant, whether it was accurate. She went back to her desk that afternoon and noticed that she had stopped doing the particular nervous things she used to do with her hands during phone calls, the pen tapping, the notepad corner folding, the ambient physical restlessness of a person whose mind was running ahead of the conversation. She had stopped doing this without noticing she'd stopped. She watched Bruno, lying in the patch of thin winter light by the rear window, and she thought, "You are doing something to me that you did not ask permission for." She thought, "I think I am okay with this." She thought, "I think I have been okay with this for longer than I realized." The question she had been carrying, "What does this animal require of me that I do not yet know how to give?" was beginning to resolve itself, not through direct answer but through accumulation. What he required was not technical. It was not a matter of the right food or the right space or the right handling protocol, though all of those things mattered. What he required was presence without performance, reliability, the actual showing up, every morning, every evening, in the same way. Not because it was required by love in the sentimental sense, but because it was what consistency looked like in the language he spoke. She thought about what Dr. Howell had said. "He already knows what you are. The question is whether you do." She thought, "I am beginning to." There was a day in late January when it was clear outside, the particular crystalline clear that came after the worst cold broke, when the light returned thin and sharp and the air smelled like metal, and the sky above the Douglas firs was a blue that looked painted. Elena went out in the afternoon with a coffee and stood in the yard. Bruno was at the far end of the property, near the corner of the enclosure, looking at the tree line. She watched him. He was completely still. His coat caught the light and made it into something silver and gray and deep. He was looking at the trees with that ancient, patient attention that she had first seen on the kitchen floor 6 weeks ago and that had not changed since. He was looking at whatever was in the trees, deer, rabbit, bird, something she could not see or hear, and he was not moving toward it and not moving away from it. He was simply there, present in the cold, clear afternoon, inhabiting the moment with a completeness that she did not think she had ever managed in 34 years of living. She watched him for a long time. Then she finished her coffee, went inside, and fed him. He came in from the yard with snow on his paws and ate his dinner with that same focused attention he gave everything. She sat at the kitchen table and watched him eat and thought, I am not the same person I was in November. Not worse, not better. Different. Arranged differently. As if something had come into the house and quietly moved the furniture of her while she was busy looking at the permit paperwork and the blood test results and the enclosure specifications. She had thought, when she found him, that she was solving a problem. It had not been a problem. It had been a door. And on the other side of it was not a rescue. Not exactly. Not anymore. She would keep trying to find the right word for it. She thought she probably had time. 6 months after Elena found Bruno in the drainage ditch on Route 9, a woman named Lucy Farrow drove out from Missoula on a Saturday morning with a notebook, a camera, and the quiet, organized energy of someone who had been studying wolves in domestic settings for long enough to have stopped being surprised by most things. Dr. Agnes Howell had connected them. Lucy was not a scientist. She was a writer who had spent 2 years documenting the lives of people living with wolf hybrids across Montana and Idaho, and she had asked Dr. Howell if there was anyone new worth speaking with. Dr. Howell had mentioned Elena without much preamble, which was very much in keeping with her personality. Lucy arrived at 8 in the morning. She sat in the kitchen with her notebook open and a mug of Elena's coffee in both hands, and looked at Bruno, who was in the doorway, watching her with the particular steadiness that Elena had come to think of as his default setting. Lucy said, "How long before he settles with me?" Elena said, "I don't know. He'll decide." Lucy looked at Bruno. Bruno looked at Lucy. Lucy looked back at her notebook. He settled approximately 45 minutes into the conversation, not by doing anything dramatic but by moving from the doorway to the far wall of the kitchen and lying down, which Elena had learned to read as assessed, not a threat, proceeding. She told Lucy. Lucy wrote it down. They talked for 4 hours. Elena had not talked about Bruno at this length or depth with anyone except Dr. Yates and Dr. Howell and Oliver Grant, and those conversations had been largely technical. This conversation was different. Lucy was interested in the texture of the experience, in what Elena had noticed and how she had changed, and what she understood now that she had not understood before. Elena found herself saying things she had not said aloud, about the morning she understood he had chosen her, about the sensation of being inside his territory, about the way her own rhythms had reorganized without her direct involvement, about the silence that was not an absence. Lucy wrote steadily. At one point she looked up and said, "Do you consider yourself his owner?" Elena was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I consider myself his person. Whether I own him is a question for the permit office." Lucy smiled. She wrote it down. Toward the end of the morning, Lucy asked if she could see the enclosure. Elena took her out. Bruno came with them, walking slightly ahead, in that way of his. The day was cold and the light was pale and the Douglas firs were dark against the gray sky. Lucy stood at the edge of the enclosure and looked in. She looked at the dimensions, the shelter, the way the sightlines worked. She said, "This is well built." Elena said, "I built it myself." Lucy said, "It shows." Bruno went into the enclosure and walked the perimeter once and came back to the gate and sat down. He looked at the tree line. Lucy watched him. She said, "He's always watching the trees." Elena said, "Always." Lucy said, "Do you ever think about what he sees out there?" Elena said, "All the time." Lucy said, "And?" Elena said, "I think he sees everything. I think he always has." Lucy was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Does that feel like a burden to you?" Elena thought about it. Then she said, "No. It feels like the opposite of a burden." Lucy looked at her, and then at Bruno, and then at the tree line. She wrote something in her notebook and closed it. On the drive back to Missoula, she called Dr. Howell and said, "I think I found one of my chapters." Dr. Howell said, "I thought you might." Elena did not know about any of this. She was in the kitchen when Lucy's car reached the end of the driveway and turned onto Route 9. She had a second cup of coffee. She was reading the behavior log that she still kept, a habit that had outlasted the 90-day permit requirement because she had found that writing things down helped her understand them. She read back through the entries from the beginning. November, December, January, February. The entries were brief. She was not a particularly elaborate writer, but they mapped something across their dates, a kind of arc that she had not noticed while living through it, but could see now in the accumulated entries. She turned to the most recent page. She wrote, "He has been here 7 months. I am not sure what I expected at this point. I am not sure I expected to be different, but I am. He watches the trees. He checks the perimeter. He eats and sleeps and moves through the house and the yard with a completeness of self that I think about more than I should. I do not know what the next year looks like. I know that when I think about the drainage ditch and the eye in the flashlight beam, I do not think about what I chose. I think about what was set in motion. Those are not the same thing. She closed the notebook. Bruno came to the kitchen doorway and looked at her. She looked back. The afternoon was quiet and the coffee was cooling, and the light through the rear window was the washed-out pale gray of a February afternoon in Montana that seemed to go on forever in both directions. She said, "What do you know that I don't?" He turned and went back to his spot by the window. She sat with her cold coffee and thought about it. She had been thinking about it for 7 months. She thought she might be thinking about it for the rest of her life, and this did not feel like a problem. It felt like something else, something she did not yet have a word for, which was fine, because the best things rarely arrived with their names already on them. Outside, somewhere in the Douglas firs, a branch shifted under the weight of leftover snow and released it, and it fell in a quiet white cascade. She heard it. Then she looked at Bruno. He had heard it 30 seconds before she did. His ears had moved, filed it, and returned to neutral, all without any visible thought, all without any pause in his breathing. She watched him. She thought, I am living with something older than anything I have ever understood, and it has decided, for reasons that belong entirely to it, that I am worth staying beside. She thought, I hope I keep earning that. She got up and refilled her coffee and went back to her desk and went back to work. The summer came with a particular quality of light that Elena had forgotten about, the way you forget things you only think about once a year. Long evenings that stretched into 10 o'clock with the sky still holding its color, pale gold going slowly to green, going slowly to the deep blue of a Montana night that came down from the mountains and sat on the land like something tangible. She spent those evenings outside as often as she could. She had built a second chair for the porch in the spring, though she could not have said exactly why at the time. She did not have frequent visitors. Nina came once, in late April, and spent a weekend that was quieter than any weekend Nina had previously logged in her personal history. She said so at the end of it. She said, I came expecting to talk for 48 hours, and instead I read 300 pages, and watched your wolf walk the fence line, and I feel like I have been somewhere. Elena had said, that's what this place does. Nina had said, it's him, isn't it? Elena had said, I think so. Nina had looked at Bruno, who was in the yard, looking at the tree line, and said, I believe you. The second chair was not for Nina. She discovered who it was for one evening in early June, when she came outside at 8 o'clock with 2 bowls of water, one for her, one for Bruno, and set them on the small table between the chairs and sat down in hers, and Bruno came up the porch steps with that unhurried authority of his, and sat down beside the second chair, not in it, because he was not a chair-sitting animal, but beside it, close enough that his shoulder was near the leg of it, and looked out at the yard. She looked at the yard too. They sat there until the light was gone. She had not planned this. It had simply organized itself into being, the way things did around him. She thought about the second chair and what she had been building it for without consciously knowing, and she thought about the fact that she had built it at exactly the right height and placed it at exactly the right angle. She had known something she had not been ready to say out loud. She said it now, to the dark yard and the Douglas firs and the sky that was losing its last light. She said, I think we are what we are now. He did not move. He looked at the tree line. The trees were full and dark, and they held their silence easily, the way they held everything. She thought back across the months, the ditch, the mud, the flashlight in the eye, the kitchen floor, the vet clinic, the permit office in Helena, the first winter, the slow, daily accumulation of a life arranged around a presence she had not asked for, and could not now imagine removing. She thought about how none of it had been her plan, and how it had turned out to be the most considered thing she had ever done, and the consideration had not been hers. She thought about the word Lucy had used when she called to say the chapter was finished, to describe the relationship she had written about, symbiotic, 2 things in mutual service to each other's particular form of being. Elena had sat with the word for several days after that call. She thought it was accurate. She thought it was also incomplete. Symbiotic described an arrangement. What she was living in was not an arrangement. Arrangements had terms. What she was living in had a different quality, something more like the understanding that exists between 2 things that have looked at each other honestly and decided that what they saw was acceptable, more than acceptable. She did not have a word for that either. She was going to need more notebooks. The online forum had found her in February, and she had been somewhat bewildered by it at first. It was called Wolf and Wolf Dog Owners of the Mountain West, and it had 412 members and an energy that she had initially found overwhelming, because people in the forum spoke about their animals with an intensity and specificity that she recognized but had not expected to find mirrored quite so exactly in strangers. She had read for 2 weeks before posting anything. When she posted, she had written a short and factual account of finding Bruno and the subsequent months, without particular drama, because that was how she wrote. The response had been immediate and extensive. People asked questions. People shared their own stories, which were sometimes similar and sometimes very different. A woman named Deb in Idaho had written privately to say that her wolf hybrid, a 4-year-old named Scout, had displayed exactly the same perimeter-checking behavior that Elena described, and that she had been told by 3 different people that it was abnormal before she found the forum, and understood it was simply what they did. Elena had written back to Deb and they had exchanged several emails and then occasional phone calls, and Deb had become, over the spring, a person Elena talked to more regularly than almost anyone. Not because they were particularly alike. Deb was louder and more immediate and ran 2 horses alongside Scout, which was an entirely different operational situation, but because they were speaking the same language. Deb had said once, in May, "Do you ever feel like you are the one who got trained?" And Elena had laughed, which surprised her, because it was exactly the question she had been sitting with and she had expected it to feel heavier. She had said, "I think that's exactly what happened." And Deb had said, "Same. Mine spent the first year teaching me how to be calm and the second year figuring out why I wasn't very good at it." And Elena had said, "Bruno skipped the figuring out phase, I think." The forum had given her a word for what she was. Not wolf owner. Not keeper. The word that circulated in the forum, used without irony, was pack. You were in a pack. You had accepted a role in a structure that preceded you and would outlast your understanding of it, and what you got from it was not dominion but membership. She had written the word in her notebook when she first encountered it, and then put the notebook away, and not looked at it for 3 days. When she came back to it, she had written beneath the word, yes. The summer evenings were long and warm and smelled of grass and pine and something that came down from the mountains at night that had no name. Elena and Bruno spent them on the porch. She read. He watched the yard. She had stopped finding this one-sided, which was one of the adjustments she had not anticipated. He was doing something. He was doing it with the entirety of himself, with no part of his attention held back. She had begun to understand that she could put her attention on her book precisely because his was on everything else, and that this was not a deficit of relationship but its actual form. She thought about this one evening and put her book down and watched him for a long time, the way the light moved across the silver of his back, the small incremental adjustments of his ears. She thought about all the things she had needed to unlearn to understand this, the hierarchies she had arrived with, the expectations, the framework of rescue and ownership that had evaporated within the first 2 months without her realizing it was going. She thought about Dr. Howell's question, the one she had asked in the first phone call. What do you bring to the negotiation? She had an answer now. She brought the porch, the schedule, the food, the enclosure built to the right specifications, the permit filed correctly, the behavior log kept faithfully. She brought the 6 years of rural living that had taught her to be quiet. She brought the 34 years of being a person who, when she made a decision, kept it. She brought the November night when she had stopped the truck for no logical reason and gotten out in the cold and walked toward an unknown animal in a dark ditch because the alternative, driving past, had felt, for reasons she could not explain, like the wrong thing to do. She thought, maybe that was the whole qualification, stopping when everything reasonable said to keep going. She thought, maybe that was what he had been looking for when he looked at her with that amber eye. Someone who would stop. Bruno's ears moved. He had heard something in the firs. She could tell by the way his left ear oriented first, then right, triangulating. She watched him listen to it. She watched the assessment move through him like water, quick and invisible, and resolve into stillness. He was not alarmed. She went back to her book. The forum had also given her the difficult information. She had not shied from it. She read the threads about surrenders with the particular attention of someone who needed to know the worst possible outcomes. The animals given up to sanctuaries because the human structures around them had not held. The relationships that had lasted 2 years and then broken under the weight of a move, a new partner, a change in circumstance. The ones that had simply been too much, too large, too demanding of an entire reorganization of a life that the person had not been willing to make. She had read these threads at length. She had sat with each story and taken it seriously. She had asked herself, clearly and without sentiment, whether any of the failure conditions applied to her situation, the lease that wouldn't accommodate, the relationship that couldn't absorb it, the job in another city, the family that didn't understand. She did not have a lease anymore. She had a deed. She was not in a relationship. She worked from home. Her family, her sister Laura specifically, had stopped calling as often, which was a grief she carried in a particular quiet pocket, but it was a grief she was managing, and she had not surrendered anything to avoid it. She had made her choices and Laura had made hers, and the distance between them was real and would have to be crossed in its own time. She wrote these things down in her notebook in June and read them over. She wrote at the bottom, "The conditions that have ended similar situations do not currently apply. I do not consider this permanent, but I consider it current." She had learned, living with Bruno, to think in the present with great seriousness, to be here, in the specific now, with full attention. This was not something she had been taught or had chosen. It was something she had absorbed, the way you absorb the habits of whoever you spend your days with. She was spending her days with a creature that existed only in the immediate moment, that carried its instincts and its intelligence and its particular ancient competence into each present second, without dragging the previous one behind it. She was learning, slowly, to do the same. The summer evenings grew shorter as August arrived. She noticed the change at the edges of the light, the way the gold pulled back a little earlier each week. Montana's seasons moved quickly in both directions. She had 6 weeks, maybe 8, before the first frost. She went inside one evening at 9 o'clock, Bruno behind her, and locked the back door and went to the kitchen and put his bowl down, and went to her room and lay on top of the covers with the window open and listened to the night. She could hear him in the hallway, the soft movement of that heavy frame positioning itself, the settling of his breathing into the particular rhythm of an animal at ease. She lay in the dark and thought, "This is what my life is now." She thought, "It is more than I would have known to ask for." She thought, "I did not ask for it. It was given to me by an amber eye in a ditch on a cold November road, by something that made a decision about me before I had finished making one about it." She was, she thought, still catching up. She fell asleep to the sound of his breathing. The moment that divided everything arrived in late September, without announcement, the way the important moments always did. Elena had been living with Bruno for just over 10 months. She knew his weight by the sound of his footstep on different surfaces. She knew his moods by the angle of his tail and the position of his ears and the specific quality of his breathing. She knew the difference between his alert stillness and his at-rest stillness, which looked almost identical to an outside eye but were entirely different things. She knew these things the way you know the layout of your own house in the dark, not by thinking, but by accumulated presence. She had not expected to be tested. She should have. Dr. Yates had told her. Dr. Howell had told her. Multiple members of the forum had told her, without drama and without alarm, that at some point there would be a moment where the structure of the relationship was examined directly, where he would look at the question of whether she was actually what she appeared to be, where the answer would matter. She had nodded at all of this, and filed it and moved on, the way you do with information about something that has not happened yet. It happened on a Tuesday. She was in the kitchen at 6 in the evening, feeding him. She fed him twice a day, morning and evening, and she used the same routine every time. The bowl came from the cabinet above the sink. The food was measured. The bowl was placed in the specific spot on the floor near the east wall that they had settled into without discussion. This was the ritual. It had been the ritual for 8 months. That evening, she changed the spot. Not deliberately. She was thinking about a work call she had taken that afternoon, turning something over in her mind, and she placed the bowl 18 inches to the left of its usual position, closer to the center of the kitchen floor. Bruno was already in the kitchen. He was in his usual position against the far wall, watching. She put the bowl down and stepped back. He did not move to it. She looked at him. He was looking at the bowl. Then he looked at her, not with alarm, not with confusion. He looked at her with the full, level attention that she had spent 10 months learning to read, and she understood in that moment that this was not about the bowl placement. The bowl was not the subject. She was the subject. She felt it move through her, the understanding of what was happening. She had put the bowl in a different place, and the different place was in the center of the kitchen, closer to the exit. It was a small change. It was also, in the language he operated in, a question, a re-examination of parameters. He had not moved to the bowl not because he was refusing to eat, but because something about the situation required clarification before proceeding. She picked up the bowl. She walked back to the east wall. She put it down in the original position. She straightened up and looked at him. He looked at the bowl. He looked at her. He walked across the kitchen and ate his dinner. She stood against the counter and her heart was beating in a way she was not expecting, and she was not certain for a moment whether what she was feeling was her legs or the floor or some combination of both. She thought, that was the test. She thought, that was the whole test, and I almost missed what it was. Because it had not been dramatic. There had been no growl, no display, no confrontation. There had been a look and a pause and a question delivered in a language that had no words in it, and the answer had been required not loudly but absolutely, and she had given it. She thought about what Dr. Howell had said. He will test limits once, only once, and the response matters. She had thought response meant action, meant something observable. She had imagined, in the idle way you imagine hypothetical situations, that it would be obvious, that she would know it when it happened because it would be large. It had not been large. It had been 3 feet of kitchen floor and a bowl in the wrong place, and a look that said, "Are you who I believe you are?" And she had said yes, not with words, with the bowl back against the east wall and her feet steady and her eyes level. She stayed in the kitchen for a long time after he finished eating. He went to the doorway and lay down, and she stayed at the counter and let her breathing return to its normal pace. She called Deb. She said, "The test happened." Deb said, "Are you okay?" She said, "Yes." Deb said, "Did you pass?" She said, "I think so." He ate dinner. Deb was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That's the answer." Elena said, "It was so quiet I almost missed it." Deb said, "They're all quiet. That's the part nobody tells you. It's quiet and it matters more than the loud things." She sat with the phone after the call ended. She sat in the kitchen and thought about what had moved through her in the moment she understood what was happening. It had not been fear. It had been something closer to attention of the sharpest kind. The kind that arrives when you realize you are being taken seriously by something that does not take things lightly. She had been taken seriously. She turned this over in her mind. She thought, "I have been in meetings and evaluations and conversations where I was assessed by people who had decided the outcome before the process started, and this is nothing like any of that." She thought, this was actual. Bruno got up from the doorway and crossed the kitchen and stood beside her for a moment, just stood there, his shoulder at the level of her hip, not asking for anything, not performing, just present. Then he turned and walked to the hallway and lay down in his nighttime position. She looked at the east wall, at the bowl in its correct place. She said, to the empty kitchen, "All right." She turned off the kitchen light and went to brush her teeth, and the house was quiet in the specific way it was quiet when everything in it was settled, and she thought that was the closest thing to ceremony this relationship was ever going to have. That was fine. She was not someone who needed ceremony. She went to bed. Through the night, she could hear him breathing in the hall. She slept better than she had in months. The year turned without particular drama. October came down from the mountains with its cold and its color, and the Douglas firs held their green, but everything around them went to gold and rust and the particular deep red of the sumac along the fence line. Elena spent the autumn weekends outside more than she usually did, because the quality of the light was the thing she missed most acutely during the gray months, and she had learned to store it. Bruno moved through the autumn with something she could only describe as ease. She had noticed this the previous November, his first full month after she found him, but she had not had enough information then to understand what she was seeing. Now, a year on, she had the comparison. Summer Bruno was engaged and present and watchful, which was his permanent state, but there was a settled quality to autumn Bruno that was subtly different, as if the cooling temperature and the changing light were a language his body already knew, had always known, and was returning to with recognition rather than arrival. She mentioned this to Dr. Howell on the phone in October. Dr. Howell said, "What you're describing is circannual rhythm, seasonal behavioral patterning. It's stronger in high-content animals because the wolf's annual cycle, denning season, breeding season, dispersal, has a biological component that domestic dogs have largely lost. He responds to the year the way wild animals do." Elena sat with this. She had been thinking about wildness for months, about what the word meant, applied to an animal that slept on her kitchen floor and understood the location of his food bowl. It was easy to say that he was wild. She used the word sometimes, in conversation, in the forum, but she had come to think it was not quite right. Wild implied unclaimed, unincorporated. He was neither of those things. He had claimed and incorporated himself with great deliberateness. What he was, she thought, was intact. He was intact in ways that domestic dogs were not. Not better, not worse. Simply more fully in possession of what he originally was, carrying it forward without apology or modification. She thought about what it was like to be around something intact. She had spent, she realized, a significant portion of her adult life around things that were not. People who had softened their edges for social utility. Situations that had been rounded off. The particular blunted quality of life and arrangements that required everyone to be a little less than what they were. She had accepted this as normal. Most people did. Bruno had not softened anything. And what she had found on the other side of adjusting to that, on the other side of learning his language and meeting his requirements and accepting the reality of what she had brought into her house, was not difficulty. It was something that felt like the opposite of difficulty. It felt like clarity, like the air after rain, when everything was exactly what it was, and you could see clearly in all directions. She wrote this in the notebook in October, and then felt slightly embarrassed by it, and did not show it to anyone. In November, on a Sunday afternoon, she drove to Hartfield and took a chair she had ordered from the furniture store on Main Street. It was a reading chair, solid and well-made, with good armrests and a fabric that was a deep, practical gray. She put it in the corner of the living room that had previously held a bookshelf she had moved to the bedroom to make the space. Bruno watched the installation of the chair from the doorway. She sat in it and picked up her book. He walked across the living room and lay down beside it. Not at the foot of it, beside it, his back against the chair leg, his legs stretched out toward the center of the room, his eyes tracking toward the front window. She looked at the top of his head, 6 inches from her knee. She said nothing. She went back to her book. Outside, the first of the winter cold was moving in from the northwest, and the bare trees along the road were black against a sky going dark in the east. The front window held the last light. A car passed on Route 9, slowing for the curve. Bruno's ears moved. She read. He watched the window. The house was warm. She thought, this is what people mean when they talk about a life working. Not without cost, not without the things you gave up and the decisions you had to keep making, but working, fitting, being, for the first time she could name specifically, in the right place with the right company, doing the right things for the reasons that are yours and no one else's. She thought, I stopped a truck on Route 9 because a patch of mud looked wrong. She thought, everything after that has been the consequence of stopping. She thought, I would stop again every time. November came in full. The anniversary of finding him passed on a Thursday without ceremony. She noted it in the behavior log, a habit she had kept even though the permit no longer required it. She wrote, 1 year. He is 92 pounds and in good health. The perimeter checks continue. He knows every inch of the 6 acres, and I know, by this point, most of him. What I do not know, I am still learning. She closed the log. She went to the kitchen and filled his bowl, and he ate, and she made herself dinner, and they sat in the living room in the gathering dark, she in the reading chair with her book, and he on the floor beside her with his eyes on the window. And the wind came in from the northwest and moved through the Douglas firs with a sound like the sea, and the house held them both. She had thought, a year ago, that she was rescuing something. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong in the specific and important way that changes you when you understand it. Not a mistake that leaves damage, but one that leaves room, clears something out, makes space for the actual truth of what happened to sit. The actual truth of what happened was this. He had been in the ditch. He had been down and cold and without reserves, and he had been there for long enough that he had made a kind of peace with the possibility of staying there. She knew this not from any document or any specialist, but from the way he had looked at her in the flashlight beam. That had not been the look of an animal that still had options. That had been the look of an animal that had run its calculations and arrived at a final position, and was waiting to see what the world had left to offer. She had been what the world had left. She had stopped the truck. She had gotten out in the cold. She had carried him to the blanket, and then to the vehicle, and then to the kitchen floor, and she had made scrambled eggs and filled a water bowl, and sat on the kitchen floor across from a 90-pound wolf hybrid, and talked to him about omelets. And he had looked at her, in those first hours, and run his own calculations, and arrived at his own decision. She had thought she made a choice on Route 9. She had, but so had he. And his, she understood now, had been the one that mattered, because he was the one who knew what he was looking for. She had only known what she was willing to do. Willing was enough. Willing, it turned out, was everything. The wind moved through the firs. The window held the dark. He breathed beside her chair with the slow, even certainty of something entirely at rest, and she read her book, and the house was warm, and outside the November road was empty in both directions, the way roads are when the important things have already arrived. She turned a page. He opened one eye and checked the window and closed it again. All was well. She had known it for some time.